Most people think retirement works like this. The paychecks stop. The account starts shrinking. And from that point on, every dollar you spend is one less dollar you get to keep. That sounds reasonable. It also happens to be the part most people get wrong. Because retirement is not just a savings problem. It is an income structure problem. In January 2026, the estimated average Social Security retirement benefit for a retired worker is $2,071 a month. For an aged couple where both spouses receive benefits, the average is $3,208 a month. That is not a side note. That is real income already covering part of life before your portfolio does anything at all. And that is why the question that matters is not, how big is my portfolio? The real question is not, what is my portfolio actually responsible for? That number has a name. It is your real spending gap. And once you understand that gap, a lot of retirement behavior starts making sense. Why some people retire with less fear than expected. Why others keep getting wealthier even without a paycheck. And why a lot of people who technically have enough still live like they do not. So in this video, I want to break one thing apart very clearly. Not the fantasy version of retirement. Not the panic version either. The real mechanics. Because if you miss this, you will do one of two things. You will either overwork your final decade because you think the target keeps moving. Or you will arrive at retirement with enough money and still be too afraid to use it. Both are expensive, just in different ways. Let me make the contrast even sharper with two simplified retirees. John retires at 65 with $1.30 million. He has no pension. He is extremely careful, almost proud of how careful he is. Every purchase runs through one filter. If I spend this now, will I regret it later? Linda also retires at 65. She has a somewhat smaller anxiety problem. Not necessarily a bigger portfolio problem. She has $1.10 million, a small pension, and Social Security starting soon. She does not think of her portfolio as a vault. She thinks of it as one layer in a system. 10 years later, both of them may be wealthier than the day they retired. Not because either one found the perfect stock. Not because they went back to work. But because the portfolio was never being drained at the rate they feared. That is the part people miss. The portfolio can still grow when withdrawals are smaller than expected and guaranteed income is doing more of the work than people gave it credit for. And when that happens, two very different retirements can emerge from similar balances. One person feels under constant threat. The other feels informed. That difference is not trivial. It shapes daily life. It shapes whether you help your adult children without panic. Whether you delay healthcare because you hate seeing the cash leave. Whether you visit friends. Whether you move closer to family. Whether you downsize when it makes sense or cling to a house because the decision feels like giving something up. A lot of retirement pain is not raw math. It is misread math. And misread math becomes managed emotion. That is why I push so hard on the gap. Because the gap turns a vague fear into a defined job. It tells you what the portfolio must do. It also tells you what it does not need to do. And that second part matters just as much. Your portfolio does not need to carry your ego. It does not need to prove that you won. It does not need to match somebody else's number from the internet. It does not need to justify a lifestyle you do not even want. It needs to support your life. That is it. Anything beyond that can be useful. But it should not become the standard that keeps moving every time you get closer. Here is the first mistake. Most people plan retirement by staring at one giant number. 1 million. 1.5. 2 million. Whatever number feels psychologically safe. But retirement does not ask one question. It asks for at the same time. What will you actually spend? What guaranteed income is already coming in? What changes in taxes? And what extra costs show up later anyway? If you do not look at all for together, the math feels scarier than it really is, and sometimes cleaner than it really is. That is why people stay confused. So let's start with the rule. Your portfolio does not need to replace your working income. It needs to cover the gap after everything else is counted. That sounds small. It is not. It changes the entire picture. Let me show you why. The first shift is spending. A lot of people assume retirement spending will look basically the same as working life spending. Maybe slightly lower. Maybe not. But in practice, entire categories of costs often disappear the moment work disappears. Commuting, work clothes, payroll taxes. For employees, that payroll bite alone is 7.65%. And then there is the money you were pushing into retirement accounts in the first place. That outflow stops too. So a household that thinks it was living on $80,000 a year may realize it was actually funding a work machine that cost far more than life itself. Take away the work-related costs and the spending requirement might drop to $60,000. Same house, same basic lifestyle, same vacations. Not austerity, just less friction. That is already a 25% smaller problem. The second shift is guaranteed income. This is where people systematically underestimate what is already covered. Again, the estimated average Social Security benefit in January 2026 is $2.71 per month for a retired worker and $3,208 per month for an aged couple both receiving benefits. So if a household needs, say, $70,000 a year to live comfortably, and Social Security is covering around $38,000 to $42,000 of that depending on the situation, the portfolio is not responsible for $70,000. It is responsible for the difference. That is the gap. That is the real job description of the portfolio. The third shift is taxes. When you are working, you are dealing with ordinary income taxes, state taxes in many cases, and payroll taxes. Once you retire, the payroll piece disappears and taxable income often falls. Not for everyone. Not equally. But often enough that the money coming out of the portfolio is taxed less harshly than people assume while they are still in peak earning years. So now step back. If spending drops, if guaranteed income shows up, and if taxes can change, then the portfolio is not carrying the whole load people imagine. It is carrying the leftover load. That sounds obvious once you say it. But most people never run the number correctly. And when you do not run the number, your brain fills in the blank with fear. Now, before this turns into fake optimism, we need to deal with the part a lot of retirement conveniently skips. Yes, the gap is often smaller than people fear. No, that does not mean the math is simple, because there are leaks. Real ones. The first leak is healthcare. Medicare does not mean healthcare becomes free. For 2026, standard Medicare Part B premiums are set at $200.90 per month, with a $283 annual deductible. And that is before you add supplemental coverage, dental, vision, prescriptions, and all the things that tend to get more expensive as you age. So when somebody says, "You'll just let Medicare handle it," what they usually mean is, "I have not fully priced this in yet." The second leak is IRMAA. High enough income can trigger surcharges on Medicare premiums. For 2026, the first threshold for Part B, IRMAA starts above $109,000 of modified adjusted gross income for individuals and above $218,000 for couples filing jointly. So now imagine this. Required minimum distributions arrive. Social Security is on. Investment income is coming in. and suddenly your premium is not the standard premium anymore. That is not a disaster, but it is not nothing either. The third leak is what people sometimes call the widow penalty. One spouse dies. One social security check goes away. But the tax brackets get less favorable because the surviving spouse is now filing as single, so the household income falls, but the tax structure often gets tighter at the same time. Same life. Less room. These are not weird edge cases. These are part of retirement reality. And if you ignore them, you are not being optimistic. You are being incomplete. So what does the complete picture look like? Let's run the kind of math people should be running before they decide whether they are ready. Say your retirement spending target is $70,000 a year. That is your baseline. That is what life costs. Now say Social Security covers $42,000 of it. Immediately, your portfolio is not responsible for $70,000. It is responsible for $28. 0. Now layer in taxes. Maybe another $4,000. Add healthcare. Maybe $8,000. Now your real portfolio gap is not $70. 0. It is $40,000. That number matters. A lot. Because if you apply a 4% withdrawal framework to a $40,000 gap, you need about $1 million. But if you mistakenly think the portfolio has to cover the full $70,000, you start acting like you need $1.75 million. That is a $750,000 difference in perceived need created by one bad calculation. Not bad investing. Not bad discipline. Bad framing. And that bad framing changes behavior for years. I have seen people sit on perfectly workable retirements because they were still solving for the wrong number. They were not actually underfunded. They were underclarified. That is a different problem. And once you get the real gap right, other decisions become easier to see. Should you delay Social Security? Should you do Roth conversions in low-income years? Would part-time income in early retirement dramatically reduce pressure on the portfolio? Would a dividend or rental stream create enough buffer to avoid selling assets in a bad year? None of those questions are answerable when you are just staring at one giant portfolio balance and asking, is it enough? Enough for what? That is the real question. Enough to do what? This is one reason people in their late 40s and early 50s often feel trapped. The account may be growing. The salary may be solid. On paper, they are doing fine. But psychologically, the target keeps drifting upward. Why? Partly because of social comparison. Someone online says $2 million is not enough. Someone else says you need $3 million in a high-cost area. Another person says the 4% rule is dead. Another says you should never count on Social Security. And suddenly the entire conversation becomes an arms race of fear. That kind of content gets attention because it activates loss aversion. It makes people feel prudent for staying worried. But worry is not the same as precision. And the opportunity cost of permanent caution is enormous. If you work 5 extra years because you truly need to, that is one thing. If you work 5 extra years because no one ever showed you how to calculate the actual gap, that is a very expensive misunderstanding. 5 years is not just 5 more paychecks. It is 5 more years of time. 5 more years of health at whatever age you are then. 5 more years of deferred plans. 5 more years telling yourself you will live later. That is a real cost. It just does not appear in a spreadsheet. And this is where a second problem shows up. A deeper one. Even when people finally run the numbers, even when the gap is manageable, a lot of them still cannot spend. This part matters more than people admit. Because money habits do not switch off just because your job did. If you have spent 25 or 30 years in accumulation mode, your instincts are trained in one direction. Protect the balance. Save more. Delay gratification. Do not get sloppy. Do not relax too early. That mindset built the portfolio. It helped. It was useful. But then retirement arrives and the entire game changes. Now the money is supposed to support life, not just sit there proving that you were disciplined. A lot of people never fully make that switch. So it happens. They tell themselves they are being prudent. And sometimes they are. But often they are being driven by loss aversion. They do not feel the value of spending the money nearly as strongly as they feel the pain of watching the account go down. Even if the spending is affordable. Even if the plan supports it. Even if the market growth is still replacing what they spend. They just cannot emotionally detach the act of spending from the fear of future regret. Then self-justification steps in. They'll do the trip next year. They'll renovate when the balance is a little higher. They'll feel better once the market settles down. Next year comes. The balance is higher. The comfort never shows up. Because the problem was never just the number. The problem was the operating system. Let me make that concrete. Say a retiree has a $2 million portfolio. Nothing aggressive here. Just assume a 5% average annual return. That is $100,000 in growth. If that person spends $50,000 that year, the portfolio can still end the year higher than it started. And yet a lot of people in exactly that kind of position still live as if one reasonable trip or one home update is going to destroy the plan. Why? Because they are not managing from structure. They are managing from anxiety. And anxiety is a terrible planner. It reacts to headlines. It reacts to read numbers on the screen. It reacts to old survival habits. It does not care that the underlying math may still be fine. This is the quiet cost of not understanding your spending gap. The loud cost is obvious: people fear running out of money. The quiet cost is worse in a different way. They do not run out. They underspend. They protect the balance so hard that they miss the healthiest, most mobile, most flexible years of retirement. The years the money was actually meant to fund. And then, later, the balance is still there, that the window is smaller. This is where a lot of retirement conversations get emotionally dishonest. They treat underspending like a virtue automatically. It is not. Sometimes it is discipline. Sometimes it is fear wearing a respectable outfit. You can see the pattern everywhere. People stay in homes that no longer fit because downsizing feels like loss. They skip experiences they can clearly afford because spending feels dangerous. They compare themselves to some abstract image of safe instead of defining what their own money needs to do. That is not financial clarity. That is social comparison mixed with loss aversion. And it creates a weird outcome. People who spend decades building security still do not feel secure. The same thing happens on the other side. If you enter retirement and spend the first decade acting like every dollar is dangerous, that cost is real too. You cannot compound lost time with your grandkids. You cannot recover the trip you were healthy enough to take at 67, but not at 79. You cannot refinance regret. This is why be conservative is not a complete strategy. Conservative about what? Conservative in service of what? If the goal is safety, then yes, respect uncertainty. Respect sequence risk. Respect healthcare inflation. Respect the fact that life does not follow a spreadsheet. But if the goal becomes endless postponement, you are no longer protecting life. You are shrinking it. And this is where the emotional shift in retirement gets missed. During accumulation, the habit that makes you win is restraint. During distribution, the habit that makes you win is calibration. Not reckless spending. Not denial. Calibration. Knowing what is covered. Knowing what is flexible. knowing what can wait, knowing what matters enough that you do not want fear making the decision for you. That is a different skill set. And most people were never taught it because the financial industry spends far more time teaching people how to save than how to use what they saved. So when retirees hesitate, it is understandable. They are not irrational. They aren't trained for the second half of the game. That is why I think clarity is worth more than another generic retirement milestone. Milestones feel good. Clarity changes behavior. Once you know your gap, you can test scenarios instead of guessing. What happens if you delay Social Security by 2 years? What happens if you downsize and reduce the gap permanently? What happens if a small consulting income covers health care and early retirement? What happens if you convert enough to Roth each year to manage future taxes without triggering unnecessary Medicare surcharges? Now the planning becomes concrete. Now it becomes yours. Without that, people keep living inside vague sentences. I think I'm close. I should probably keep working. I don't know if I can afford it. I'll wait until I feel better. That last sentence is the most dangerous one. Because for many disciplined savers, the feeling never comes automatically. They are waiting for certainty. Retirement does not offer certainty. It offers ranges, probabilities, income layers, trade-offs, and decisions. Which means the real upgrade is not from uncertainty to certainty. It is from anxiety to structure. If you are in your mid-40 seconds to mid-50 seconds right now, that is the window where this matters most. Not because time is about to run out. That is not the point. The point is that there are still a few levers you can move before retirement locks in more of the outcome. 3 in particular. First, calculate your real spending gap. Not your fantasy retirement spending. Not your stripped-down emergency spending. Your honest spending. Include travel if you care about travel. Include irregular expenses. Include health care reserves. Include the things you will actually want your life to contain. Then subtract guaranteed income, Social Security, pension, annuities if you have them. What is left is the real job of the portfolio. That one number is more useful than 10 vague conversations about the right retirement number. Second, build income in layers. Stop thinking about retirement income as one giant pile of invested money. Tier 1 is guaranteed income, Social Security, pension. That is your floor. Tier 2 is buffer income, interest, dividends, maybe rental income, maybe part-time work early on. Something that reduces the need to sell portfolio assets constantly. Tier 3 is portfolio withdrawals. That should be the last line you draw from, not the first line you panic about. Because when income is layered well, volatility becomes less threatening. A bad market year does not immediately force a bad decision. Third, control tax timing while you still can. For many retirees, there is a window between the year they stop working and the year required minimum distributions begin. Under current IRS rules, the required beginning date for many owners is tied to age 73. That window matters. Because low-income years can be the best years to do Roth conversions. Convert $50,000 in a year where you are effectively in a 12% bracket and the tax bill is around $6,000. Convert that same $50,000 later when income is higher and the bracket is 22% and the bill is about $11,000. Same money, very different tax cost. Now multiply that over several years. That is not a minor optimization. That can become a major difference over a retirement that lasts 20 or 25 years. And it is not just about taxes. Better timing can also help you avoid pushing yourself into higher Medicare premium territory later. So no, you do not need a perfect plan. But you do need more than vibes. Because that is what a lot of people are really using. Vibes. one big account balance, a generic rule of thumb, and a low-grade fear that they are probably missing something. Usually, they are, not because retirement is impossible, because the picture was never assembled in one frame. So let me boil this down. Retirement is not mainly about replacing your salary forever with investment withdrawals. That is the mental model that scares people. Retirement is about figuring out what your life actually costs. What income is already covering part of it. What taxes and healthcare do to the rest. And what gap your portfolio truly needs to fill. When that gap is smaller than you thought, the future can look a lot less fragile. But the point is not to make you complacent. The point is to make you accurate. Accuracy is what gives you options. And options are the whole point. Because this was never really about money in the abstract. It was about freedom. The freedom to stop working when work no longer needs to dominate your time. The freedom to absorb a rough market year without feeling like your life is collapsing. The freedom to spend on what matters without treating every dollar like a threat. The freedom to make decisions from structure instead of fear. That is what financial security is for. So here is the practical move. Do not start by asking, what number do I need to retire? Start here. What do I expect retirement to cost each year? What guaranteed income will already be there? What should I realistically add for taxes and healthcare? And what gap does that leave? Write that number down. Because once you know the gap, the conversation changes. Keep following the old path, and you may spend years chasing a number without ever feeling safe. Take the new path, and the money finally becomes what it was supposed to be in the first place. A tool, not a threat. That choice is still yours. Until then, you are not planning retirement. You are negotiating with anxiety. And those are not the same thing.